A spineless captain enables the horrific behavior of his friend, allowing him to cause consistent, intentional harm to his fellow crewmates. That friend, the ship's co-pilot, not only rapes one of his crewmates, but actively creates disasters just so he can be the one to fix them. A mechanic relapses into alcoholism, reminiscing about his drunken past with a disturbing fondness. His relapse isolates him from the crew and leads him to lie about the ship's damages. The assistant mechanic, a naive kid who only got the internship because of familial connections, takes nothing seriously but desperately craves approval. And finally, the ship's nurse, if you can call her that, is so nauseated by her injured captain that she is completely incapable of doing her job. Obviously, the severity of each individual's transgressions vary significantly, but what do they all have in common? They have to Mouthwashing is the second-ish game from developer Wrong Organ. Their first game, How Fish is Made, is probably a game you haven't heard of, unless you found it in one of two ways. Either you're one of the 500,000 mouthwashing owners on Steam who just got curious about the developer's previous work, or if you're like me, you discovered it through Jacob Geller's video, Gross Games About Flesh and Stuff. How Fish is Made is in every sense unapologetically bizarre. A grotesque, surreal metaphor for religion, those who are a part of it and those who reject it. If you didn't know anything about how fish is made and what I told you seems to be conflicting with what you're seeing on screen, then you're just going to have to take my word for it. Mouthwashing, by contrast, is something entirely different. There's no clear thematic connection between the two games, and that absence of connection is exactly what interests me. Mouthwashing takes that same surreal unease and applies it to something far less fish and much more human. The slow unraveling of a group of people trapped together, forced to confront not just survival, but their own moral failures, as well as a whole lot of mouthwash. And don't worry, we're going to be talking about the mouthwash. The game opens with all of the information we need. A crew of 5 is on board the Tulpar, a long-haul space freighter presumably delivering cargo for a company named Pony Express. And the title of long-haul freighter isn't kidding, because the expected duration of this trip is 382 days, and they have been traveling for 147. The game then tells us, I hope this hurts. We'll come back to that, because as soon as the game starts, the crew, or at least the captain, is alerted to an asteroid traveling in their flight path. Turning left would avoid the asteroid altogether. Mouthwashing is ultimately about one thing: responsibility. The game is very on the nose about this. I mean, it literally flashes on your screen like a cheap jump scare. But after finishing the game, it was clear that there were two kinds of responsibility present. The first being professional responsibility. The crew has a responsibility to their ship and to each other. By performing the requirements and responsibilities of their roles, they benefit both the ship and their crew. Curly, the captain, has the responsibility of protecting his crew. He is supposed to steer both his ship and his crew, making sure both are getting where they need to be. He is the leader. Sometimes it requires having hard and uncomfortable conversations, and sometimes it requires disciplining crew members who act maliciously. But those are the responsibilities of a leader. Jimmy's responsibilities are very similar to Curly's, as the co-pilot, keeping the crew safe, supporting his captain, and swallowing his pride when his captain makes a decision he doesn't like. But most importantly, understanding that he is not the one meant to steer the ship or the crew. Anya is the ship's nurse. Her responsibility is to keep the crew physically healthy and perform her duties even when the injuries are severe and gross. Swansea has two responsibilities. He has his duties as the ship's mechanic, and he has his duty as Daisuke's mentor and teacher, ensuring the ship runs smoothly, communicating damages to the captain, as well as teaching Daisuke, are all a part of his job. And finally, Daisuke as an intern has the responsibility of being open to learning and being willing to help Swansea with whatever he needs done. Now, considering the intro of this video and that this is a horror game about a ship being stranded in space, you can rightly assume that precisely none of these things happen. In fact, just about every step of the way, exactly the opposite happens. Jimmy, the co-pilot, was not happy with his responsibilities. He was jealous of Curly. He wanted his position. He has a hero complex. He causes problems consistently so that he can be the one to fix them. Instead of protecting the crew, he intentionally causes harm to them and uses his position to manipulate and take advantage of the others, literally raping one of them. Curly knew about the disgusting behavior of Jimmy and was too cowardly to do anything about it. He failed his responsibility as a captain to everyone, but especially to Anya. He even allows an emotionally unstable Jimmy into the cockpit unattended. For basically the entire game, Swansea is non-communicative. In fact, he blatantly lies about having a working cryo chamber in the utility room. Granted, his motives were wholesome, and I wouldn't have told Jimmy either, but it doesn't help that he relapses, becoming a drunk, uninterested in helping the crew solve any of the problems they face. And before the crash, he had no interest in mentoring Daisuke. Instead, he simply tried to get rid of him. Speaking of which, Daisuke cared too much about approval. He wasn't actually interested in being helpful or learning. He blatantly ignores Swansea's warning about the air vent leading to the medical room. He even mentions that he was only there because his parents got him the internship. All he ever cared about was approval. Finally, Anya was too sickened by the injuries that Curly had that she consistently asked for someone else to give him his medicine. Now, I'm not going to pretend that all of these failings are the same, nor am I going to pretend that there's no context for them. But regardless of the reason, they all had a job to do, and they failed to do it. Failing at your job is one thing, but what about your choices to actively harm others? I'm referring, of course, to personal responsibility. The responsibility you have to yourself and your actions. Having a responsibility to do something and taking responsibility for something you do are not the same, and it's clear that the game distinguishes these. In the case of Jimmy, he takes responsibility from Curly, meaning he literally steals it. But ironically, he never takes the moral responsibility for his actions. Not really. Jimmy's warped view of responsibility can be seen during Swansea's death. Jimmy is in every way directly responsible, for lack of a better word, for the death of Swansea. I mean, he literally points a gun at a helpless Swansea and pulls the trigger. But as he's doing this, he says, "I'm going to fix this." The game over and over again tells us to take responsibility, but what does that even mean? Is merely admitting to your wrongdoings enough? Is apologizing to the people you hurt enough? Is fixing it enough? I hope this hurts. The words from the opening scene. Is that enough? Does having the responsibility for your actions hurt somehow fix the pain you've caused? Is taking responsibility an internal decision or an external one? Is it a curse of the victims of your actions, or is it a curse to yourself? In some twisted way, does having the responsibility hurt free you from the guilt of it? Do you take that pain selfishly because it's your punishment? Ultimately, I don't know. The game doesn't tell us. What it does tell us is that there's no escaping that pain, at least not by doing any of the things the characters do. So, what do the characters do? After Daisuke is injured, Swansea decides that dumping mouthwash all over his injuries isn't going to help. He takes it upon himself to put Daisuke out of his misery. Daisuke was his responsibility. He should have done more to prevent him from crawling into the vent. The cryo chamber he was hiding was not for himself, but for Daisuke. Later, he accepts the fact that relapsing was an easy choice for him. He says that his days as an alcoholic, his days spent with the world spinning as he sunk into the couch, were the best days of his life. It feels as if the mercy killing of Daisuke was a punishment for himself. During Swansea's execution, he says that he wanted to raise his kids to be better than him, something he had the opportunity to do for Daisuke, an opportunity he squandered. So, he accepts the bullet that Jimmy has for him. He's ready to face the music, as he says. After all, in his eyes, he deserves it. Anya never really takes the responsibility for not being able to provide Curly his medication. She never fixes it. Overwhelmed and traumatized by both the guilt of not being able to help Curly and the fear of being trapped in a spaceship with her rapist, while also carrying his child, she blames herself. She claims that she's gonna fix everything, words she takes straight from Jimmy as she locks herself in the medical room. She finally gets the strength to accept her responsibility and finally administer Curly's medication, except she administers it to herself. All of it. She takes her own life while hiding from the person she's afraid of, and next to the person who never helped her. At least there was a lock on the medical room door, even if there wasn't one on the door to her personal quarters. For the first time, she's finally able to keep Jimmy out. Daisuke, having never really taken much seriously, decides to finally step up to the task. They need to get into the medical room, and the vent that Swansea warned about is the only way in. And funny enough, Daisuke is the only one small enough to fit, or the only one naive enough to actually try. By doing this, he can finally get the approval he so desperately seeks. At least that's what Jimmy tells him. But at that moment in time, he accepts his responsibility. He needs to be the one to save Anya and Curly. He's the only one who can. It's his responsibility. Everyone will be so proud of him. Finally, we're left with Jimmy and Curly, the two who need to take responsibility the most and the two who do it the least. Jimmy is ultimately the reason that everything goes wrong. Jimmy is the one who crashed the ship, not Curly. Although Curly's not completely innocent here, as he let Jimmy into the cockpit despite knowing his unstable state. Before any of the events of the game, Jimmy used his position as co-pilot to assault Anya. He manipulates Daisuke into climbing into the dangerous air vent, preying on Daisuke's desperate need for approval. He tries to fix this by dumping mouthwash onto Daisuke's wounds. He does this even though he knew that the mouthwash had too much sugar to actually clean the bacteria. He kills Swansea for some reason with a gun that he was never supposed to have, all while claiming that he's going to fix it. This constant desire to be the hero is what drives Jimmy to continually create problems just so that he can be the one to fix them. He never does. Ultimately, at the end of the game, he tries to redeem himself by saving Curly and killing himself, but we're left with this feeling that it just isn't enough. Does saving Curly and shooting himself really fix anything? No, obviously not. Curly, similarly, never really takes responsibilities for his actions. Granted, he looks like this for most of the game, so he's just kind of a bystander, a spectator to Jimmy's deplorable actions. Curly's punishment is losing the ability to do anything, much less stop Jimmy's tyrannical massacre. Although, it's not like he ever did anything to stop Jimmy anyways. The important thing to note here is that everyone takes responsibility in a selfish way. Well, everyone other than Curly. He kind of just screams. But nobody tries to fix the problems they create. They just try to help themselves deal with the guilt of it. Swansea's lie about the cryopod is one thing, but his alcoholism is what allowed him to be drugged by Jimmy, leading to Daisuke crawling into the air vent. So when his time comes, he just accepts his death. Despite Anya's actions being understandable, it seems like the guilt of constantly relying on her victimizer was just too much for her. Jimmy is the only one she asks to give Curly his medication, nobody else. By taking her own life, she's leaving everyone on the ship with someone as insane as Jimmy, without telling anyone how dangerous he actually is. Daisuke's constant need for approval is what led him to being so naive as to ignore the warning of Swansea. Jimmy refuses to accept any of the things he's done. He saves Curly and shoots himself, refusing to live with the unspeakable things he did. He goes out with the last thoughts in his head likely being, I fixed it. I'm the hero. Nobody ever takes responsibility. I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to blame the victims of Jimmy. Daisuke was manipulated by Jimmy, Anya was assaulted by him, and Swansea was murdered by him. None of those things are the fault of the individuals. But as a collective, they could have stopped Jimmy, and they didn't. It's not like Curly would have said anything about it. They had a responsibility to each other, to protect each other from Jimmy. But everyone was too selfish, too worried about making themselves feel better that they weren't able to protect each other. That's the true horror of mouthwashing, responsibility, living with what you've done and trying to make it right. Something we never actually see happen. The game leaves you with this what not to do sort of guide, but it's up to us to figure out how to live with the responsibilities we have and how to take responsibility for what we've done. The true horror is being in a position where you are responsible for others and how easy it would be to abuse that, or how easy it would be to say nothing when you know of or have seen something terrible. It would be just as easy to fall back into old habits because you never truly gave them up. or to be so desperate for the approval of one or two very specific people that you're willing to put yourself at risk while ignoring the warnings of everybody around you. Unlike many interpretations of mouthwashing I've seen online, I don't think that mouthwashing is merely a critique of capitalism. It's something far less political and much more personal than that. By trying to make it such, you're missing much of the symbolism and imagery present in the game. On the other hand, it's clear that mouthwashing isn't not a critique of capitalism, and to ignore that would be to miss equally as much. But I do think that commentary is meant to be targeted a little differently than just capitalism. If mouthwashing is a critique of anything in capitalism, it's a critique of the power structures, the intentional ignorance of abusive managers, and the unfulfilling nature of trying to climb to the top of the ladder. I think there's also a good argument to be made about it criticizing automation, the replacement of human workers for the sake of efficiency and free labor. For this story to be made in a creative medium, the clear parallel is to AI and the reaction artists can have to that. There's also something to be said about the responsibility an employer has to its employee and the responsibility of the creator to the consumer. But all that conversation is a little out of the scope of this essay. Something that definitely is within the scope of this essay, and something that I promised to talk about at the beginning of it, is the mouthwash. There is a lot of mouthwash in this game. Mouthwash is meant to be something you use after you brush your teeth. It's used to remove a bad taste and kill any remaining bacteria. It's meant to be used to start fresh. What it's not supposed to be used as is a replacement for a genuine thorough cleaning of your teeth, even if it does taste better. However, the mouthwash present in mouthwashing is not even capable of handling its own responsibility. It has too much sugar to be effective, as mentioned by Anya, so the mouthwash is forsaking its responsibility for pleasantness, just as the crew forsakes their responsibilities for the more pleasant outcome. They don't properly clean themselves, they cut corners, something they criticize Pony Express for doing. Their actions only serve as a way to make them appear cleaner. This brings us to the title of the game. Mouthwashing. On the surface, this is just because of the sheer amount of mouthwash present, but in that case, it would make more sense if the game was just called Mouthwash. Instead, they chose to name it after the process, mouthwashing. The game is about the process of taking responsibility, washing your mouth thoroughly, not just as a way to appear as if you've done that. And this brings us to the last kind of responsibility, the responsibility that we have. Not the responsibility I've talked about in reference to your personal life, but our collective responsibility as viewers to the game. There are often debates about the importance of authorial intent when it comes to artwork. Whether or not that truly matters isn't up for me to decide here, but I can tell you that what the author intends is not the only correct way of interpreting art. Take responsibility is not only a message to the characters in the game and not only to us to use in our personal lives, but maybe even more than either, it's the game giving us the responsibility of interpreting and receiving the game. One could say that it's my responsibility to the game as a video essayist to make this video. But not only is it that, my responsibility is to this channel and to you guys. I also need to take responsibility for the lack of discipline I've had when it comes to making videos. Taking responsibility for the endless hours I've spent playing Marvel Rivals, Monster Hunter Wilds, and countless others means that I'm willing to change that behavior, that I'm willing to do a proper, thorough cleaning. The mouthwash in this case is the freedom from the guilt I have during those hours. By making this video, I'm taking responsibility for the time I've wasted and I'm letting go of the guilt, the constant knowing that I should be working on videos. Like I said, this was my responsibility to mouthwashing. If I finished the game and did nothing with it, I would be no different from Curly. I watched, and I waited, and I did and said nothing. I was presented with something difficult, and I did nothing. And if I kept on that path, I would have been no better than Jimmy. I did what I could. I had one successful video, but it's been too long since my last one. I can't redeem myself, so I'll just give up on everything I've ever loved and disappear. I couldn't do that. How could I? Who would I even be if I let a piece of media so profoundly impact me and I just ignored it? I hope this hurts. Maybe it was a message to us. It was the game telling us that we are about to see ourselves, and if it hurts, then good. Something will change.